We have a lot to cover in this conversation. Just to add to that, I've been in India for 4 years now. I run the New York Times coverage for India and the region. So I'm hoping that that will add a little bit to our conversation. Um, just to set the stage for our conversation with Ambassador Menon, I'm going to read just a couple. Shankar. Shankar, I'm going to read a couple passages from his book. If you haven't read it, I found it very, very lucid. I'm very surprised in how much is packed into beautiful prose. That is something rare to find from sort of practitioners. So this I found hugely helpful. I'm going to read just a couple brief passages, and then I will start off on our first topic. Um, Ambassador Menon wrote, I think in 2021.
Well, the book was finished in 2018, actually,
Okay.
but published in
Published in
21.
21. About essentially how India connects to the world and to the region. He said, paradoxically, as India has evolved and gathered power in the international system, its need for and dependence on the world have steadily increased. Um, that is sort of a first starting point for our conversation. In particular, in recent years, we've seen India kind of integrate with the United States a lot more. And I'm sure this is on everybody's mind with the new Trump administration. And if we see a more inward looking America, in the book you do mention that at no time soon we'll see a less powerful America. It is more about how America uses its power. And if we see an America that sort of is more inward looking, what will that mean for India in Asia and also India in the world?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Mujib, for that question. Trump had to take over the conversation, right? It seems to me that because of the way in which India has developed since, radical reform in 91, by integrating with the economy, using the globalized world economy, second largest beneficiary of globalization after China, that's why the paradox that I mentioned, that India might be more powerful, more prosperous, much more active internationally, but is also much more dependent on, this is also true of China. China is more integrated, more dependent on the world today than she was when she started her rise. So, and the interesting part is that it's come at a time when now the world is maybe not closing, but certainly globalization has plateaued and it's changing its nature. And the main driver of that process, of the world economy and so on, the US, is turning inwards. I mean, it's not just, and this is not one side, political side or the other. It seems to be a deep-rooted conviction across, we've seen it now across 4 administrations, one after the other, that opening up to the world didn't work to the US advantage, and I think President Trump represents the extreme view that tariffs are going to save America. And now that leaves countries like India, China, Brazil, others who did well out of globalization in an awkward position. So what do? Because they need an open, enabling international environment to continue to grow and to improve the lot of their own people. And if the major power doesn't want to do this, which is why I think we're actually in a dangerous moment. Because today, if you look around the world, every major power is revisionist. There isn't one of them who's happy with the world the way it is. Whether it's Make America Great Again or even Biden's Build Back Better, or whether what Putin is doing is clearly revisionist. The Chinese also clearly want to change the international system. So all the powerful countries in the world are united that they don't like what the present state of the world. That makes it very unstable and a little dangerous for the rest of us. And for those of us who need a peaceful, enabling environment, because our job is what? Is to transform India, to better the lot of the Indian people, right? That's what we have a foreign policy for. So if that's our job, this makes it much harder.
In that revisionism and sort of the protectionism, in the book you mentioned that it's been almost more than a decade that this is sort of post the 2008 economic crisis. How did that economic crisis play into sort of protectionism and revisionism?
Well, I think 2008 really brought it home in the West and led to, I would call, a crisis of confidence. Before that, I mean, they were masters of the universe. They'd made the rules, they ran the system worked for them. But 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the fear of another Great Depression, which was only averted by the G20 in London in 2009 by actually working together with those who were outside that traditional system, by working together with China, with India, with Brazil, with the others, and therefore to redo the system. I think that fear, I think, of having an open world system continued. Since then, my own feeling is that we've been between orders. You know, many people like to say, oh, this is a multipolar world now. I think governments say it because it flatters them to present themselves either as a present or future pole. But we're not actually multipolar. We're just confused. You look at it, economically, there's about three big blocks, right? There's USMCA, North America, there's the EU, there's the RCEP with China at the center of it in Asia. We're the only major economy outside anything. Militarily, there's only one country which can project military power across the globe when it wants, where it wants, and that's the US. Everybody else is a regional power, can maybe make life difficult or make the US think twice in their region, but outside their region, they're not, including China. She's still, 10 years from now, who knows? But today, the world is unipolar militarily, and politically, it's thoroughly confused. You look around at the year of elections last year, it's complete. So to say there's an international order, I mean, there hasn't been a binding international agreement on any issue of consequence for the last 2 decades. What does that tell you? It tells you there is no international order. So for me, we're between orders. And frankly, we shouldn't be frightened of this. For most of history, there has been no world order. The hegemon will tell you you need an order because then you need a hegemon. But for most of us, most of history, we did very well without an order. It's just after World War II, we got used to the idea of some kind of order, a bipolar Cold War, a unipolar moment after that, after 89. So frankly, I don't think we should be scared of it, but we should recognize it for what it is.
On the military sort of power, that there's this one global power that can project military force, this declared hesitance from the US president, the new US president, that I don't want to get involved in wars. Does that become a factor in how people perceive the US military power also? Or the fact that they have it, what the leader says, whether he's going to use it or not, doesn't mean much?
You know, some of it, the US has the same problem that India does. We do all our business in public. We argue, we fight, you know, so the rest of the world thinks that this actually reflects our own confusion and weakness, and that and then we surprise the world by actually doing things. If you look at absolute US power, it has not declined. I mean, the US for the last 40 years has been around 25, 30% of world GDP, steady, hasn't declined. You look at the US role in the world, control of financial sector, for instance. You look at the things that matter. I just mentioned military power. None of that has changed. It's only because of this internal argument that the US has been going through that everybody else assumes the US has lost the will to power. But I don't really see that in practice. If you think of the last 3 years in West Asia, the US has used the opportunity to redo the geopolitics of the Levant entirely in its own favor. Regime change in Syria, Assad is gone, wiped out Iranian proxies in Lebanon, in Gaza, Hamas, Hezbollah, wiped out, exposed Iran's weakness by not just permitting but enabling actually Israel to bomb to bomb the defenses, the air defenses for Iran's nuclear plants and establishments. So it's clear, and yet Iran hasn't been able to retaliate. So the Middle East has been redrawn in the last. Hamas actually gave the US and Israel a perfect excuse to do what they wanted. That's not an example of a declining power who's going home and not intervening. It's a power that's using power smartly, using other people to do it, get its work done, but achieve results. So I don't buy into this decline, lost interest, but I think sensibly, Trump and others, and the Biden administration, say the US will not intervene instinctively, directly, every time it's asked to. It'll intervene when its interests demand it. And if there are cheaper, better ways to do it, if partners will do the work, let them do the work.
If we could sort of stay in West Asia, because we got there now. In the book up to sort of 2018, as you're writing, you talk about sort of Iran actually expanding its influence in a way. How suddenly that has been reversed in the past year or so surprised you in any way?
Nothing's permanent in geopolitics. I mean, when I wrote the book, that's why I said 2018, clearly Iran's influence was expanding, also because Iran was pushing at an open door. There was fundamental change coming within Israel, within Saudi. Syria was in a state of civil war. Lebanese politics was a complete mess. And so Iran was able to actually extend influence, work with Hamas and Sunni groups like Hamas and so on at that time. But as I said, nothing's permanent, right? This isn't permanent either. You can't, because the street, not just the Arab street and the Shia street, but the street generally through the Middle East is very unhappy. After all, you've seen the slaughter of innocents in Gaza. And that is not something that will not have political consequences. You've seen the mess in Israeli politics. Okay, Bibi needs a war because he has to stay out of jail or wherever, but that's not a stable basis for a new order. So I'm not saying that this is a stable new order which is going to last forever. The Middle East is going to stay the Middle East and it's going to keep changing. So I'd be very careful drawing big conclusions, long-term conclusions like that.
In the book you mention your skepticism of what really was a world order, or how much was it a maintained pretense, right? And that hasn't, in the ways that has fallen apart in the West Asia, in the past events of the past year.
But my skepticism was about the adjectives.
Okay.
To call it liberal, to suggest that it was orderly. People say the Cold War. It was cold in Europe, maybe, and in North America. But throughout the Cold War, every day 12,000 people died in conflict between the Mediterranean and the Pacific. That's not a Cold War. It's not very orderly, it's not very peaceful, and certainly not liberal. And when you look at the regimes on both sides, you had authoritarian regimes on both sides, whether you call them dictatorships or totalitarian or communist or whatever. And so I'm very nervous of these labels. I keep thinking that you need to do what the Chinese used to say, which is listen to the words but watch their actions.
In the decade sort of in West Asia, whether it was the tensions, Saudi-Iran tensions, whether sort of the Gulf complications and the blockades that played out, whether over the past year, what we've seen sort of the Israel-Gaza war expanding to Iran, Lebanon, how much of a challenge has that posed to India, and how has India handled sort of the tumult of that region?
Well, India's traditional approach to trouble in West Asia, which there's always been, has been to stay out of their internal quarrels, not become part of their internal politics, and to work with all the regional actors. Because West Asia has always had a shifting balance between regional powers, between, well, originally, historically, Egypt and Persia, And then you could add now Turkey later, then now Israel, and so on, now Saudi Arabia. Uh, but that shifting balance between them has meant that anybody who gets involved in their fights or picks sides in their internal politics ends up burnt, unless you have the power of the US and are essential the way the US is. So that's traditionally the way, because India has huge interest to protect that. Not today, we say about 8 million Indians living and working in the Gulf. Over 60% of our energy imports come from the region. More than that, even last year, remittances were 3 times foreign investment into India. We got $123 billion worth of remittances to India. And most of that is actually out of the Middle East, not out of the US or Europe. So peace in West Asia actually is in our interest, is deeply in our interest. And when you think of the consequences of conflict and so on and how it affects oil prices, our people there, every which way, it's dangerous. So there's been consistency, therefore, in what Indian governments have done in West Asia. No matter who is in power, what their ideology at home might be, they've done much the same thing, and for a very long time.
On Israel and sort of the relationship with Israel, uh, there's a history to how India maintained ties with both sides by recognizing Israel, but at the same time, sort of the Palestinian presence in India and that relationship. Um, Over the past year, have you seen anything change on that status quo?
It's, it's interesting. We recognized Israel immediately after its formed, though we voted against the resolution because we didn't like the idea of partition. But once we'd done that, we actually stayed in touch with Israel right through. There was an Israeli consulate in Mumbai right through the 50s, 60s. In 1974, we faced an 8-day oil boycott by Saudi because of our ties with Israel. In those days, we were being accused of being too friendly with Israel. Then we went through a phase when we were accused of not being friendly enough in the 70s and 80s. But we'd kept our links going, especially on the defense, intelligence, security side. Those have been consistent from the 50s. And it's worked for both of us. The actual establishment of embassies took place in 92 when there was a real hope in the Middle East peace process after the first Gulf War. And when actually Yasser Arafat stood up in Delhi and said, please go to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem because they should hear other views as well. So we did. And that relationship has boomed ever since. If you look at sentiment in India, it's hard to measure. It's extremely polarized on Israel. But you can't say that overwhelmingly Indians are in favor of what Israel's presently doing. But the idea of Israel gets overwhelming support. But everyone has their own idea of what Israel should be. And that, in that sense, we're no different from Israelis. Each Israeli has his own idea of what Israel should be too. So, and we are actually very similar. I mean, when I went to Israel, I remember thinking that this is the only other place where you argue everything out in public and you make it all sound like the sky's about to fall. But there's a fundamental unity which still operates.
In terms of how foreign policy becomes part of domestic political discussions, right? Um, the impression we get is that the ruling party in India has a very strong relationship with, say, the ruling party in Israel and between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi. And at least sort of the social media, the online debate, it feels like that balance has shifted one way, right? As practitioners of foreign policy, how does sort of the domestic political debate shifting in one direction make that balancing act that's been sort of the historical nature of the relationship of having ties with both sides, how does that become difficult? And how does sort of practitioners and diplomats navigate that side of it?
Well, I'm not sure that actual policy has shifted that much, but it's true, we do much more together today. But then so do Israel's Arab neighbors. If you look at it after October 7th, 2023, none of the Arab neighbors actually broke relations with Israel. Nobody went home. There's still talk of the Abraham Accords, of getting Saudi Arabia to actually recognize Israel as part of a larger attempt to settle the problem that we face today. So I think a lot of what you mentioned, this general impression that somehow India's tilted to one side or the other, partly I think it's useful to those who spread the idea, but I'm not sure that it's actually borne out in the practice. But it's also easier today for India to have a full spectrum relationship with Israel when everybody else is doing it too, irrespective of what's actually happening on the ground. So it's whether you look at Egypt's relationship with Israel, you look at what Saudi Arabia is doing with Israel, even Turkey, who has major issues with Israel, but works with Israel, deals with them. And I think that really is the only basis for a policy in the Middle East, that you do what works, be practical in what you're doing. And everybody understands you're following your self-interest. What they don't understand is when you say you're doing one thing and you do something else in practice.
There's, in terms of...
By the way, you mentioned the BJP. BJP has traditionally been very, very pro-Israel. Partly for ideological reasons, but consistently, even when they were in the opposition for many years, they were the ones who supported that relationship. And so it's natural that they have a good relationship now and that the present ruling party should
But the core of policy hasn't changed in the sense of...
I'm not sure. I don't think that has changed, whether it's the attitude to a two-state solution or whether it's the attitude to Palestine or whether it's condemning, the massacre of people, whether by terrorists or even by state forces, and arguing for peace and stability in the region.
In one of the other factors in sort of when you look at West Asia you describe in the book is that many of the nations there are at different stages of sort of solidifying as a state. They're much more turbulent. On the one hand, India needs to have presence, and it's a connected world. On the other hand, what the threat that creates in terms of what could come India's way. You mentioned the threat of Islamic extremism. You mentioned the security challenges that they come for that. How has India handled that sort of expanding presence in these turbulent areas of West Asia and yet protect itself from sort of the influences, the extremer influences?
Well, if you look at the dilemma is that you look west of India and you see weak state structures, which are therefore brutal because they're weak. And you see all kinds of, non-state actors who are powerful, whether it's IS or whatever, that's the most extreme case. But there's, religious authorities, all kinds of authorities who otherwise you don't. Whereas you look east of us, it's the Westphalian states, which they may be new in historical terms, but they're more and more powerful, and they run according to the way that political science tells you they should run. So east of us, actually, the traditional tools of diplomacy, statecraft work. But going west, you have to deal with what you find. So it's not enough just to deal with the states and to run, state diplomacy. You need also to get out there and deal with or manage or counter the various other actors, some of which are hostile to you, some are not. Frankly, we as India have never had a problem with the forces of Arab nationalism, partly because they see similarities in our historical experience. But we have had problems with the political uses of Islam and many of the actors who then use it to justify terrorism and violence and so on. And so west of us, it's a much more complicated job. You work with everybody, whoever you can. And I think that's something which I think mostly the commentariat misses. The rest of the links. I mean, we're in a place which has such long historical links with West Asia. And in many ways, that's what provides stability and ballast to our relationship with the Gulf, certainly, and with large parts of the Middle East.
In this reality where you kind of have to deal with non-state actors, with a diversity of actors, the India's diplomatic corps and India sort of as the state, have you seen that willingness and sort of that capacity to engage with that sort of gray as much?
We live and learn. Yeah, we've learned over time.
And where is, when you look at it, where is that learning stand in terms of how much they're engaging?
You know, I mean, clearly, how do I put this politely? There are West Asian states which have walked both sides of the road as far as terrorism is concerned. They've supported some of the instigators, but at the same time, they work with us to try and limit the effects of what they do. We don't call them out in public because that serves no purpose, but we do both. We counter the negative things that come out of that. We also try very hard to prevent the radicalization of Indian populations abroad in these places. Now, that's not something that states can do very easily. That's something that society, communities, other non-governmental organizations do. So there's a whole host of, there are various levels of things that need to be done to deal with that. And I think that's something we've learned slowly over time.
I think one example of that we could sort of address a little, and it gets us closer to the neighborhood, is the example of the Taliban. In India, how has India handled the Taliban? I know that has a complicated history. There's a history of sort of violence there directed at Indian interests. There's a history, Pakistan comes into the question. But as the end game in Afghanistan was kind of getting closer, it appeared that there was a reluctance on part of India to engage with players like that. Where others, whether it's Iran, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, anybody in this sort of geography that felt they had to have those ties, India was quite far behind in that. When you look at that example, and when we look at how things are changing now, is that an episode of Live and Learn that we mentioned, or that is a more complicated history in that?
I don't think the full history of how we dealt with the Taliban has been written yet. It's not true that we were never in touch with the Taliban before they came to power this time. We were in touch with them in between. But there were three problems that we had with the Taliban, and I'm going back here. One is that when Pakistan faced the risk of being called a state sponsor of terrorism by the US, while after the Afghan war was over, after the Soviet withdrawal, they then outsourced the training, the support, etc., of jihadi tanzeems which were acting against us, Lashkar-e-Toiba, etc., into Afghanistan, two elements in Afghanistan, and the Taliban actually used it as an occasion to make money, and they provided facilities and so on. Secondly, the Taliban's attitude to Indians and people of Indian origin in Afghanistan. There's a long-standing Sikh community and so on, which is a problem. Thirdly, their relationship with ISK, Khorasan, in Islamic State Khorasan, was very ambiguous until much later. Mm-hmm. And so we chose to work with those who dealt with what bothered us. Now, in some ways, there is an exaggerated idea in India, I think, of the terrorism risks that Afghanistan poses to India. In the last 40 years, there's been one Afghan terrorist caught in India. That's it. Pakistanis, yes, scores, but not Afghans. So once these three issues were dealt with, and they happened to be taken care of over time, we started talking to them. This is long before, this was actually in the early 2000s. And we kept in touch with them, but their scope was very limited because their whole goal in life was to come to power in Afghanistan. And there wasn't much that we were going to do to enable that. So they went to those who were ready to help them. Now, of course, the situation's changed. Now they are ruling Afghanistan. They behave like Afghans. So they have trouble with Pakistan. They're pretty prickly about what they've said they'll stop supporting various Xinjiang groups, for instance, or things out of Russia, but most of those groups are still there.
In the way sort of the Taliban's relationship with Pakistan has played out over the past couple of years, it's very tense there right now. In terms of,
I think they've always been tense.
they've always been tense, but
You
in
look at Baradar, look at how many years he spent in
many of them, many of their senior
Pakistani
leaders.
custody while they were supposed to be allies.
Do you think there was a little bit of sort of an oversimplified impression of that in India, that they are a complete tool of Pakistan, that is not a relationship of mutual interest?
I don't think we ever made that mistake in government. But they had to be free enough to exercise their choice. And that only happened once they came to power.
And if we could just sort of keep moving like that with the region, when you look at
I
Pakistan,
think I said somewhere in the book, and I know I've been saying since 2012, that if the US is going to withdraw, they should withdraw quickly and be done with it, because Pakistan will have an Afghanistan problem as a result.
and that was clear as early as.
I think it was always clear. They had the same problem with Dawood.
Mhm.
When he was in power, they thought he was their friend. He was going to settle the Durand line as a frontier. Once he came to power, there was no way he could do it. No Afghan would do that.
The fact that that withdrawal didn't happen, it dragged on for another decade. And our impression was that in that decade, as Afghanistan got more complicated, India's approach was a lot more sort of coordinated with that messy US presence. How do you see sort of the way India was working with the US in a complicated and messy Afghanistan? The US-India relationship playing out there?
I think both of us were pursuing our own objectives, and they were largely congruent, is the way I describe it. But they weren't identical. And I think what we did was to concentrate on things that would build up a long-lasting relationship with Afghanistan. For instance, most of our assistance went to small development projects, which communities would choose themselves and tell us what they wanted. An additional room in a school, or a culvert, a bridge somewhere, a road, which is why not one of our projects was ever attacked by the Taliban in Afghanistan, right through that whole period. When they're busy fighting the Afghan government, they're fighting NATO, they're fighting everybody else. They never touched any of that. So we concentrated on trying to do things which established a solid base for the future. 500 scholarships to Afghan students, for instance, that kind of thing. And it was quite amazing, the response from the Afghans. When we first opened up scholarships, we held an exam just to see whether people could use the scholarships. And something like 3,000 people came to do that in a country which was supposedly bombed back to the Stone Age, which had been in civil war, had fought the Soviets for over 40 years. It was just incredible, that will to life in Afghanistan. And that's what we were concentrating on. We weren't running police stations or trying to do the stuff that actually attracted,
Yeah. And Pakistan, obviously, when you look at Pakistan, its current state right now, sort of the internal chaos of Pakistan, and when you look at how has Pakistan changed in sort of India's calculation, and where does it stand now in terms of India's outlook for the region?
I can't speak for India's calculation. I can tell you what I think. It's, for me, there are many Pakistans, right? It's a brand new state, still trying to build a sense of nationhood. Ziaul Haq was supposedly asked, why are you doing Nizam-e-Mustafa? Why are you doing Islamization? And his answer was, look, if an Egyptian stops being a Muslim, he's still an Egyptian. But if a Pakistani stops being a Muslim, he's an Indian. So they're still building a sense of identity. I don't know if it's true or not, And so there are many Pakistans. There's the Pakistan of the army, of the jihadi tanzeems. We have a real problem with them because they have an institutional interest in a hostile relationship with India. But the Pakistani politician, the civilian politician, he'll go where his advantage leads him, where he can. Pakistani civil society, they have no animus to India. I mean, you saw it when we did open up the relationship between 2003, 2007. You saw the response from civil society. So I'm not so sure that, you can talk of a view of Pakistan or a view of, or that you can run a coherent Pakistan policy. Because it's so much also a part of your domestic politics that you can't run a simple policy like you would with, say, Fiji or Denmark or somewhere. And today you've worked yourself into a position where it seems to serve the interests of the ruling elite on both sides to maintain some control level of hostility. Control. I mean, if, God forbid, you end up with an Indian pilot on your hands, you return him in 24 hours. You don't want this to escalate. But you want the hostility because it justifies your political position and serves your political interests at home. So you've worked yourself into this strange position, which is stable. I mean, if you think of it, the ceasefire, which was the 2003 ceasefire, which was reimposed 4 years ago, has held. There is actually peace on the LOC. But it's not a good relationship. I mean, you're quite happy to maintain this strange equilibrium.
Stable but sustainable in any way, or does it lead to anything? Will it lead to anything? This idea that we could sort of isolate Pakistan as much as possible, not talk much about it, not sort of engage with it, and hopefully that's sort of punishment.
I don't know. Politicians are short-term maximizers. I mean, the future is the next election. That's it. So I don't know about whether they are designing these to be sustainable or not.
And if we sort of keep going to the region, and we've got another 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. When you look at developments in Bangladesh and the churn there and sort of how India managed that and where things stand, what do you make of that, and where does sort of that relationship stand for India?
I'm very nervous about making predictions about Bangladesh right now because for me, what's happening in Bangladesh is a revolution. It's not just a coup, it's not just some readjustment within the old ruling elite. And revolutions by their nature are unpredictable. We don't even know who actually runs Bangladesh today, whose word counts. So I'm very nervous about predicting where it goes. Luckily, most of what we did in the last 15 to 20 years with Bangladesh was really not party political, but in the interest of people on both sides. Whether it was opening up border hearts all along the border for people to trade, whether it was building power lines so that we can exchange power, and Bhutan, Nepal can also send power into Bangladesh, both from the east and the west, whether it's giving Bangladesh a stake in power generation in India, which they would then own and they'd know how it's, and including in hydel, we were ready to, whether it's opening up inland water transport and so on, and opening the Indian markets to Bangladeshi goods, setting in place the trains, the travel, etc. Now that frankly benefits people on both sides. It's not linked to one government or another. So to me, the logic of that kind of cooperation will continue and continue to lead ultimately to integration. But in the meantime, you're going to have political turbulence because of the revolution in Bangladesh. And we'll have to see how it goes. We'll just have to manage that.
That's another sort of
now,
area.
The other problem, of course, is because of the turbulence, various people are going to try and use it. So it's going to be much more complex than it has been before. There's no question. But predicting...
Not necessarily predicting, but that is essentially one complicated situation that has resonated in the domestic politics here in a huge way. And how much how misinformed actually that the news media conversation here on Bangladesh is, and how that sentiment then can diplomats, policymakers shut that off and sort of, because of how strong that sentiment was here. I was quite surprised actually as an outsider just listening to this and then spending time on the ground in Bangladesh reporting it. When diplomats are placed in that position, when this is so loud, how do they manage it?
You hope they can shut the emotion out. But the fact is, this is the politics of emotion on both sides. And, and diplomats are human too. What my answer would be, you can't be inhuman. You can't shut yourself off. But use the emotion for something more positive. Today, if you look around India, we've really got crisis after crisis after crisis. I mean, you've had 9 governments change in the subcontinent in the last 4 years, not all of them willingly or happily or constitutionally. And you've seen economic failure in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Nepal. Now Bangladesh has a problem. You've seen what's happening in Myanmar, where there's a civil war. So you really have a polycrisis, as Adam Tooze says. For me, this is the chance to do the things that you can't do in normal times. Put in place the institutions, the links, integrate the subcontinent economically. Do what you did with Sri Lanka. When Sri Lanka defaulted and the world took 3.5 years to give them the first penny of help, you helped them tide it over. And as a result, you built a relationship which now can actually stand some of the tough geopolitics around, whether it's a Chinese presence or this or that. But you at least are much more comfortable in the way you're dealing with these situations. And I think you should use the crisis in South Asia today to try and actually move things forward. That's exactly what we did in 91. We had a huge balance of payments crisis. You saw a global crisis actually with the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. And you used it to change the way you did business, fundamentally. Things that you knew you had to do, but that in normal times were very difficult. Now is the time to do something like that. And that's what diplomats and politicians should be doing today in South Asia. But, I'm an optimist, as you can see.
Sri Lanka is a very interesting example just because India stepped up in a way that surprised a lot of people. The extent of the help. Not that India was helping. 2 things were interesting in Sri Lanka. One was China kind of disappeared in their moment of crisis in terms of the help that they needed, the help they expected from China, especially the Rajapaksas. India stepped up in a huge way. Now, two ways one could read that India has tools at play now that are generous, or was it India really squeezing to bring something to the table that it was a struggle to afford, but they knew they had to bring something big to the table? Is it a new reality of Indian diplomacy where they have a lot more money at play, a lot more tools, or this was an exceptional case?
I think it's true. We have means today which we didn't have before. But in Sri Lanka, we've always followed a very similar approach. When they had trouble with the JVP, when Mrs. Bandaranaike, we actually intervened militarily. We did again in 87. When they had an economic crisis earlier in the late 80s under Chandrika, again we helped. We signed a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka. We negotiated 97, 2000. So we've always taken a slightly different approach, and Sri Lanka has been much more willing also to do this. I remember the simplest argument when I was in Sri Lanka to get New Delhi to do what you wanted was to point out that Sri Lanka is an unsinkable aircraft carrier 14 nautical miles off our coast. And that sort of concentrates minds in Delhi. So sometimes you can use the security argument to actually do good things economically and do things for welfare. And I think Sri Lanka is a case of relatively successful policy. It's never going to be easy in the neighborhood. You have problems of intimacy, whether you like it or not, and there will be constant problems. But Sri Lanka, I think, is a better case.
And in terms of the change that happened there, you described Bangladesh as a revolution.
The
How do you view
change
that?
in Sri Lanka, we've always made it quite clear. This is Sri Lankan business. Who rules? Who does what? But we don't want to be part of their politics, and we've kept it that way.
Bangladesh is different on that?
Bangladesh also. The trouble is that in Bangladesh, the impression has spread that we choose sides. And that's going to take a long time to eliminate. Once people get an idea in their head, it's hard to change.
But it's a justified impression because
I'm not sure. It shouldn't be justified if we were truly professional.
Lastly, I know you said you don't like predictions, but in the book you do have a chapter of looking to the future. And
Dangerous thing to do.
on China, we sort of, when you look at where things stand right now, and we look at the complicating factor of the U.S. change of government, how do you see things playing out between India and China, and how is India going to navigate this sort of bilateral, but also in the context of what's happening between U.S. and China?
Yeah, on China, that's the big question, isn't it, for all of us? China's trajectory. Where is China going? Will China succeed in what she's trying to do? My own sense is that for too long, the world made the mistake of thinking that China is going to evolve like the rest of the world, right? That ultimately capitalism would come to China and they'd therefore turn into a Western liberal democracy, which was obviously not true. I don't think we in India ever made that mistake. But when you look at the pattern of Chinese development now, it looks as though they have chosen a path and they are now so path dependent that it's very hard for them to get off it. Last year, their surplus, their trade surplus was almost $1 trillion, when you think of that. Now, how long will the rest of the world put up with this? It's unlikely. So, and this is fodder to Trump and his people, for instance. So, and yet, China needs to find a new way of developing, a new development path. And she's somewhere where, say, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they all went through a 20, 30 year of tremendous growth spurt and then went through a really painful readjustment and readjusted their political and social contract as well. And I think China's somewhere there, and it's very hard to say where they'll end up after that. But the result is that from the US point of view, this looks like a peer competitor. And the US, since World War II, has worked to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor successfully. First the Soviet Union, Germany, Japan in the 80s, now China. But China is a serious peer competitor. And the big difference is that China is part of the same world economic system, which used to be run by the US, and is therefore, in a sense, a Siamese twin. The US cannot do damage to China without hurting itself, and neither can China do damage to the US without hurting itself. And yet, so they can't live with each other, they can't live without each other. It's a perfect recipe for a disastrous marriage, right? So a lot of the trouble is structural in that relationship. For India, if you were just a realist, you'd say, our job in the triangle, as the weakest party in the triangle, is to make sure that we have better relations with both other points than they have with each other and play balance. I mean, that's what Kissinger did in 1971 between China and the Soviet Union, right? And that's an insufficient answer to India's, because I keep going back to first principles. What's the point of our foreign policy or security policy? It's to enable the transformation of India. And you cannot do that just by balancing. You actually need a good working relationship with the two largest economies in the world. You can't do without that. So it's more than balance. It's actually trying to build a relationship with both at the same time. Now, each one will say, choose me, don't choose them. And in terms of stated values and so on, clearly the US is much closer to India. and has the big advantage of not being a neighbor, not having a territorial dispute with us, etc., etc. So, and you've seen that steady shift in India-US relations over time. But that doesn't mean that we've ever given up on the relationship with China, or that we can do that. Whether we can arrive at a new sort of modus vivendi, which we had with China, kept the peace for 30 years, kept the border as it was for 30 years until about 2015. That I'm not sure whether we can, but we have to make the effort. It is also necessary to keep the US honest, just as the relationship with the US is necessary to keep China honest. So, yes, there's balancing, but there's more than balancing here. And it's going to be fascinating to watch.
In this frustrating moment, while sort of India was trying to work the triangle, the Chinese behavior, especially around 2020, and you wrote in the book, was a clear complication in that approach. And then it opens up, it makes the American extended hand a lot more lucrative, a lot more attractive. But it feels like India has taken that hand, but very cautiously, that it doesn't want to take it so far where it forgets its geographical vulnerability and its vulnerability. When you look at how far India has accepted that hand, what do you make of it?
I'm amazed we've come this far, frankly, because we've always been accused of being fairly prickly about our sovereignty, about the way we go about our business. And if you look at the kinds of links we have with the US today, they're completely transformed from what they were before. Even 20 years ago, I don't think anybody would have predicted this. I mean, and it goes pretty deep into the Indian middle class, into the role of the diaspora. I mean, they sell real estate in Gurgaon today as Palm Springs and Nassau County. What does that tell you about the aspirations of that class which is buying that real estate? You know, it's really something when you think of the transformation.
And Trump Towers also.
I'm an old man, you know, I've seen how far we've come. So yes, there will always be people on both sides saying you're not doing enough, you must do more, and so on. But I think we're doing a tremendous amount already, and I'm impressed by the change.
We have 10 minutes. If I'm sure people have a lot of questions there. Please. Right there, madam in the back. There's a mic coming now. Yeah, there's two there.
My name is Neena Vyas. I used to
Speak a
formerly
little louder,
work. My name is Neena Vyas. I used to work for the Hindu earlier. Now I'm retired. I'm a journalist. I want to know that in this whole balancing between this block and that block, shouldn't the most distressing event of our times, the genocide in Gaza, shouldn't it count at all? As far as our relationship, ongoing shameful relationship with the Israelis is concerned?
We'll take one more there and then we'll take two questions. Yeah.
Sir, you left. My name is Rahul Sen. I'm from the Jaipur Literature Festival. You left your note on optimism. So, how would you rate SARC and BIMSTEC in terms of optimism or disillusionment? What is your take on that?
On the Gaza question, of course it should count. But how are you going to affect the situation on the ground? Wait, just a minute. For me, Kutti is not a policy. That doesn't lead anywhere. You need to work around the world with those who think like you and make sure that you can create outcomes here. It's not about statements or posturing or narratives. It's about creating outcomes which work. And that you can only do with other people in the international society. I would say go out and do that today. And you should be doing it. What you think of present policy and so on, I mean, that each of us has our own views. But I would say that the only way to measure the success of what we are doing, whether we're doing it right or not, is look at the outcomes. And I really think that much more must be done by the international community And we should be out there working with them to make sure that something is done. That I entirely agree with you. There's no question. But I don't think that just saying, I won't talk to you, I won't have anything to do with you, I don't think that helps actually. Because it all it does is reinforce that Laga mentality and strengthens the worst elements actually, who are precisely doing this. On Pakistan and SARC, yes,
BISMTEC.
I think on Israel.
Yeah. BIMSTEC and
BIMSTEC, SARC. Yes, these logically they should be the instruments that you use. But you know, they have the same problem that the UN has. These are organizations of member states. If member states are quarreling, how can the organization be effective? Right? I mean, it stands to reason. They can only be as effective as the member states want them to be. And that's something that you have to sort out among yourselves as member states before you can say, oh, SARC is not the answer, nor is it the problem. But it's an instrument, it's a tool. And you have to make that tool effective. You need to hone that weapon. You know, it's not something that. So I'm all for SARC. In fact, I think I've always said that SARC is the best way for us in the subcontinent because the rules are clear. Don't bring your political fights. Work on what's common. Work on the economy, society, community, culture, etc. So you've already done the hard work. You've laid out, mapped the terrain. But if the states don't want to do it, what can you do? I mean, that's my problem with it.
There's some questions on this side.
Hello, sir. The current ruling party of India currently has a major leader figure in Prime Minister Modi right now. And my question is like a two-part question. And first one is, if BJP wins another election term, who do you think a candidate would be, Prime Minister candidate would be? And in the instance that it become like a religious leader like Yogi Adityanath, how do you think India's foreign relations and policies would be?
I wish I knew. I have no idea. And thank God I don't have anything to do with it. So it's not my problem. This is the wonderful thing with retiring, It's not my problem.
But hopefully, wonderful with retiring, you could have
And
opinions about
what
it.
it'll do to Indian foreign policy, we've had governments of every political persuasion over the last 73 years. But if you look at it, there's remarkable continuity in what they've done. They present it differently. Each one claims, I'm unique, I'm better, everybody before me was an idiot, they didn't know what they were doing, but I've done it perfectly, right? But that's democratic politics. They all do this. And frankly, I think that basic substratum of interest and the fact that you are what you are will lead most governments to do much the same. When they try and do something very different, they'll fall flat on their face.
Any more? Sir.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Chandrasekhar. My question is regarding Pakistan. Now, the current situation in Pakistan seems a bit unique to me from what's happened before, because power rests, of course, with the establishment, as they call it, the army, and the politicians in power don't really have the mandate of the people, because that is with the Tehreek-e-Insaf. So there is no real center of power other than the army itself. So do you think it's a complicated situation? Is India much happier when there's a dictator in place in Pakistan?
Well, I made 2 points about that. One is, I think we're saying a similar thing, that there isn't, you can't deal with Pakistan like you would with a normal state, right? I mean, I was saying there's several, and you're saying the army. But the second point I'd make is that our actual experience of dealing with the army has not been so bad, because at least they're organized and they have a strong instinct for self-preservation. So long as you can ensure a favorable balance of power and deterrence, it works for you. Having the Pakistan army in power in Pakistan. Now, I know it's politically so incorrect to say this, but you have to make the best of a bad situation. We're not going to change Pakistan. We're not going to remake Pakistan's regime, structure, constitution, etc. That they have to do themselves. And until they do, we deal with whoever there is and who has power. And who has power? The army. So if you look at the periods of relative openness, of trade, of travel, of calm, those have been periods when the Pakistan army was actually in charge, which is true again now. The ceasefire is holding. You have relative stability. You might say this is, the peace of the grave. It's not good enough. It's terrible. But that's what it is.
Just take one or two more questions if there are any. No? I think that is the end of our session. If anybody hasn't read the book, there is one question there, sir. One last question there.
No mic.
Is there a mic? No. Time is up? Okay. Sorry, saying time is up.
I'll talk to you. I'll answer your question later.
Okay. If anybody hasn't read the book, I highly recommend it. As somebody who, as part of my day job, tries to find ways to write these very complex things in clear language, I found it hugely helpful, very honest, and very, very readable. So I highly recommend it, and thank you, sir.